Hello, and welcome back to Lights Inside the Tunnel, a new podcast brought to you by Lemoyne Campus Ministry, where we look at what social justice means in the time of social distancing. I'm your host, Fiona, and this is our first full episode, Through the Lens of Solidarity. Hi everyone, welcome back. I just wanted to take a minute to thank you for all the love, support, and feedback you gave me after posting the season intro. I read all your comments and messages, and I am so grateful, and I hope that you'll continue to join us every week. I am so excited for this week's episode. We have the most exciting guest to kick the season off. She's a beloved member of our Lemoyne community, and her compassionate intellect are forces to be reckoned with. It's Julia Walsh.
Hello.
Welcome to the podcast, Julia.
Hello. That was a lovely intro. Thank you, Fiona.
Well, it doesn't even do you justice.
Oh.
You're incredible.
Thank you.
I just wanted to start by checking in with you. How are you doing? How is your family? How are your friends? Are people safe and well?
Yeah.
What's the situation?
As you know, and most of our New York listeners know, that New York State is currently kind of in a precarious spot. So my community near Saratoga, I live in Burnt Hills, New York. We're doing all right. I had a little bit of a scare at the beginning where I thought I had been exposed, and my father is an immunocompromised individual, so I was locked down in a section of my house. But after 2 weeks of no symptoms, I was deemed okay, and I've left the house twice over the course of these 2 weeks, or more than that now. But yeah, we're doing all right. We're surviving. It's been a transition, but we shall survive.
Yeah, and I think for me, at least, one of the hardest things is I'm really lucky that I'm here with my entire family, and they are such a support system for me, but it is definitely hard to be not connected to the world is the same way as I feel like I normally am, and and to see how the world is hurting, that definitely that is really hard. So
and I think in part of that, this is the first time. So I have two siblings, and we are very close in age. I'm the middle child, and there is no more than a year and a half between each of us.
Oh wow.
So this is the first time that all five of us, my whole family, has been in this same kind of small space as adults. That now that we're all, my brother's 23, I'm 21, and my sister is 20, that there is this, we are adults. And I think that has been a big familial transition, because the relationships that we have with each other are very different than the last time we shared a space this closely. And I think that's something that is not, with our generation is a bit of a problematic situation. We're used to a certain level of independence that we now have to just kind of be okay with saying, you know what, I can't do that. Not for right now.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And, so I'm in a similar situation. I'm one of 4 kids.
Oh, man.
And I'm the oldest, so everyone's a little bit younger, and I'm the only person that currently has gone away to college. But, my sisters are nearing the end of their high school years, so they're very involved. My parents are traveling just about every weekend and every school night, getting us to go places, or one of us is driving somewhere. So my mom was just saying the other day, she was like, as scary and as sad and as hard as all of this is, I think this is probably the only extended period of time in our lifetime that we're going to get to spend just this much uninterrupted time together.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the beauty of it. So, and I know that's not the situation that everybody has. So, I'm very mindful of that, but I'm also grateful to be getting to do a little bit of that. I feel like personally, I revert back to being a child when I'm home.
Oh,
this morning,
same.
I made my dad make me breakfast. I'm almost 20 years old. I am completely capable of making breakfast for myself. But here I am, I'm like, do you want to make me some eggs? And he was like, yeah, sure.
And I think in some ways, I was talking about this with my mom, that we said the same thing. And this is kind of, I want to bring this back up when we get more into a social justice conversation, but contextualize your privilege. is something that
Yes.
like has been a thing that has rung true in my academic world. But I, with my mom, that it was, she said, she just kind of brought it up out of the blue. It is so nice that all three of you are home. And that I think for our parents, it's a really nice, and I'm very lucky that I have this kind of relationship with my parents, but that it's so nice to like get to see the human beings that we're becoming outside of our family, and now having this kind of forced family time of, look at how much you've grown. Look at all the things you can do now that I didn't know you could do. Um,
Yeah.
and that's so this is part of the contextualizing my family too, is my older brother is autistic. He has an autism spectrum disorder, and he has been living mostly on his own through a program at St. Rose College in Albany. And he's very independent now, and now that he's kind of locked down at home, it's really interesting the ways that he's grown as a human being, and the ways that he doesn't need us in the same capacity.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. And I'm really, again, that's one of those contextualizing that I'm so thankful that he had the opportunity to be able to grow and now can translate that into the family unit that we are. That's a term my dad uses all the time. Um, but yeah,
I
it's,
love that.
yeah, we're
No, thank you for sharing that story. That's great.
yeah, he's a good egg.
I'll He is. I've met him.
Yes.
I will tell everyone that, and he is just incredible. We had a great conversation when we met.
Oh,
I didn't want it to
this was
stop.
last semester. I forgot.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well, I can't even. I think we were talking about his job, but we were just like talking for like minutes and minutes and minutes, and people kept being like, Fiona, and I was like, no, 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 I'm in a conversation right now. This is a great conversation.
yes. He worked at a butcher last semester. Just for the listeners, my brother is a big he loves cooking. So he was so excited that he got placed at a butcher shop, and he made meatballs, and now whenever he's home, he makes, that has also been, my brother's independence in the kitchen is a big thing. And he's been cooking for us, and it's lovely.
And you all get to enjoy it.
Oh,
Yeah,
it's
that's
great. It's
awesome.
great. And he relishes in the attention. So it's a good it's lovely. It's lovely. It's good stuff.
And it's a good break for whoever usually cooks in your house,
Indeed,
right?
indeed. Which
Yeah.
we, to get social justicey, are a pretty egalitarian household. That we
Oh,
are. My mom cooks probably the most frequently, but my dad is also very well versed, and it tends to be something where like, so my dad used to make pasta all the time, so like he is a well versed person in the kitchen. So it's quite nice that that's another checking of my contextualizing of my privilege, is that
yeah,
I was raised in a way that it, you all cook. Cooking is a love language.
that's right. Well, I think that is kind of the perfect transition into talking about the more social justice aspect of this. So just to give everyone who's listening a little bit of context, as you can probably tell, Julie and I are good friends. Um, we met at the beginning of my freshman year in like October, but then we ended up going to this thing called the Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice together,
Woo!
which is a long weekend in Washington, D.C., hosted by a Jesuit organization called the Ignatian Solidarity Network, where you go and you meet a bunch of people from other Jesuit institutions and you talk about social justice issues, um, both through the perspective of Catholicism and then through, just kind of a pragmatic policy approach, or through a different faith perspective. And Julia has always been kind of a leading voice in a room to talk about these issues. So when I thought about someone I needed to bring onto this podcast, she was like the first person that came to mind.
That's so nice. Oh my God.
Yeah. But so what I want to talk about a little bit more, because I feel like this is such a great story and there's so much hope in this, but like also, hope, but also honesty, because I don't want to, lie to people and say everything's good, everything's great, we're all going to be fine.
Yeah.
Like I don't think that's not the solution to a lot of the sadness that we're feeling
Oh
right
yeah.
now as a world. So, I want to talk to you about your experience and time spent in El Salvador doing social justice work, because I feel like those stories can really translate as, to feelings that we're feeling in the world
Oh
right now
yeah.
on like kind of a mass scale. So can you tell everybody a little bit about um, what the El Salvador trip was, when it was, just kind of like a basic overview, and then we'll get into some of the
Oh yeah,
details.
absolutely. So in January of 2019, I went with a delegation of 11 students through CRISPAS, which is a Catholic social justice organization. And we traveled for 10 days through El Salvador. We mostly stayed in San Salvador, but then we spent a 4-day immersion in this little community called El Papaturo, where we lived with families that worked with CRISPAS. And this community was founded after the Salvadoran Revolution. That they were a group of people who had lived in another town that all became refugees in Honduras at the same time. Um, and then after the war, they slowly made their way back into El Salvador and founded this community where they share resources, and it's a very interdependent, interreliant community. The phrase "it takes a village" is like the perfect
Mm.
kind of summation of what this community does. And um, we met with several other organizations while we were there. And I just want to say too, because sometimes, especially with religious schools, these kind of abroad trips get a reputation for being what's called poverty porn, where you go to a place and you take pictures with kids and you do physical work and then you leave, and that you kind of exploit the image of what you're doing as a way to gain clout back in the first world. Um, and the particular reasoning for this trip was it was called a service immersion trip. So our primary purpose in El Salvador was to listen, to contextualize, to hear what people were saying, um, to live with them. And then when we left, to take those stories and those ideas and those experiences and kind of work them into your everyday life to help, that we to understand the place of privilege that me and the rest of my group where we were coming from, and to be able to use that to benefit these communities that don't have the same kind of vocalized um, contribution. I guess is the not quite the right word, but I'll be able to figure that out. Um,
Yeah, no, well, I'm so glad you brought that up because I was going to mention it if you didn't. I have always been very apprehensive of this idea of what is called mission trips, or
yeah.
as you called it, poverty porn, in the sense that I I'm more than skeptical. I just disagree that this idea that, if you go to a developing country and you tell people about Jesus and you build a couple houses, all of a sudden everything's going to be
Oh
better
yeah.
and you're going to have completely changed their lives. And it definitely, for me, kind of feels like a rearticulation of the historical idea of the white man's
Oh yeah.
burden. And it's very like colonial and imperial in a lot of senses. So yeah, so I
I
mean,
had a
so when
lot
I
of those concerns when I was going, that I was really um so Alice Zakari is the kind of point person who runs these trips through Lemoyne Campus Ministry, and that was something we talked about frequently, because part of why I went on this trip was I'm a history major at Lemoyne, class of 2020, and I studied El Salvador pretty intensely as part of my program. Dr. Bruce Erickson is the Latin Americanist at Lemoyne, and I was his student 5 times over the course of my 4 years. And I really wanted to go to the country, but I was really concerned that it was going to be something where um, we did labor and then left. Because something El Salvador as a
right,
nation does not need is labor. They have an oversaturated labor market. Um, but the thing that I loved was we were there to listen. We were there to be quiet,
yeah,
and that was something that if I could tell a little story, just because it kind of
yeah, go
summarizes.
for it.
So when we stayed in El Papaturo, we had a buddy from our Lemoyne delegation, and then two of us stayed in a house like among the community, and a friend of mine and also a friend of yours, Tiffany Thomas, and I,
The
yes,
best.
a queen. We stayed with this woman named Bielma, and she was the only single woman in the community, and she was also one of two. She was the only host that had running water in her house, and that was
Oh,
something that
wow.
was a really um, big thing in the community, that she had the wealth to, one, live alone, two, have running water and electricity in her home. And she was a fascinating human being, that I spoke, and I speak very little Spanish, but Tiffany speaks pretty good Spanish. And every night after we would have dinner, the three of us, um, and then we would sit out on her porch with her dog and just talk, and we ended up kind of talking in this circle where I would ask a question in English, Tiffany would translate it in Spanish, and then Bielma would answer and Tiffany would translate it back to English. And we just talked to her about her experience as an unmarried middle-aged woman. She's college educated. That was the other really fascinating thing, that she attended the UCA, the Universidad Centro America, which is the Jesuit University of Central America. Um, and she's an accountant. She was the treasurer for the community. She managed all their money, and she travels around the nation and does accounting work for other uh, businesses. And it was, she was the only person that we met who kind of lived this. She lived through the war in a very atypical way. She cares for her nieces. Her brother lives like across the way from her. Um, but we just talked to her about what it's like as a woman that didn't get married and didn't have children, and what those choices mean, in a very Catholic, very traditional nation like El Salvador. And um, she was so open and so kind to answer questions that, once we kind of thought about it, were very probing. But we were asking them
Right.
from our American kind of like, we want to know everything, tell us everything. Um, and she was someone that I will never forget, because she lived her own idea of what her truth was, that this is who I am, this is what I can do, and this is how I can help. Um, that it was
Yeah.
never about, she was never a pariah, and did not
Hmm.
carry her life choices as an example. Rather, it was, no, this is what I can do, this is how I can help people, and this is how I can survive. And it was just, I will forever kind of count her as a feminist icon in my experience.
Yes.
Um,
Ye-
she was a lovely person.
I love that story, and I love how you talk about her as being, even though she was living a very unconventional life considering the standards of society, um, she still saw herself as a member of a
Yes.
community. And I think that goes back to kind of the more um, the greater point about talking about the difference between a mission trip and a service immersion trip. And I think both of those, both the story you just told and the difference between those, gets to this idea of solidarity, which, for anybody who's listening, solidarity is basically this just idea that, we're all living in community together. The world is a global community. We all, the way we live affects other people, and that just because something doesn't affect us doesn't mean that we shouldn't care about
Amen.
it. Yeah, and I think that that's a huge tenet of social justice, but it's a huge tenet of Catholic social justice.
Indeed.
And I think that um, uh, another reason I'm really glad you're on here talking about this is I think that transition sets us up kind of perfectly for talking about, or giving our listeners the context of the Salvadoran Revolution, which I didn't really know anything about until we went to the teach-in together. And then I ended up actually writing a paper on it for one of my classes. But this is a huge thing that we do not talk about, especially in our American education system, that is a huge issue of injustice, and that the Jesuits have been really heavily involved in creating
Mhm.
justice. Do you want to talk a little bit
Yeah,
about
yeah.
that?
So that was I can use this is a great transition for one of the things that we did was we visited the Jesuit University in El Salvador, and during the independence movement, 6 Jesuits were martyred by the Salvadoran army, um, and along with their housekeeper and her daughter, and that story in particular. So one thing, this army went into the university. And killed the Jesuits not because of their faith, but because of what they were doing with their ideals that were inspired by their faith. Um, so, oh, I just lost the word. It's in my brain. Um,
It'll come
yes.
back.
Oh my goodness.
Well, I'll let you
Okay,
think
yes,
about
please.
that, and then I'll pick
Thank
up.
you.
Okay. So basically, so in the 1980s, there was, and Julia, feel free to cut in anytime you
Okay.
remember it. In the 1980s, there was a civil war in El Salvador that was in part funded by the United States of America, the Reagan administration. This takes place kind of in the greater context of the Cold War. And there was a populist movement in El Salvador by working class people, by farmers and laborers, to have a more democratically elected government. And in the context of this time, there was a lot of fear about left-leaning movements. They were all kind of coded as socialism and communism at the
Yes.
time. Although if you do like a lot of research into this, you realize that this was literally just a movement about labor justice and wanting a democracy and an economy that was equitable. It was not communism in the sense of like, Stalin or Lenin or
No, it
any of
was
that.
so people could feed their families and
Right.
themselves. It was about equitable equitable wages and survivability in a nation of really, really extreme inequity.
Right, where like basically all laborers were still kind of performing a form of slave labor for the remnants of the colonial and imperial ties that had existed in El Salvador, up until like pretty recently, until that point. But so the United States was really threatened by that, and we basically funded a military coup which crushed this movement and put this really right-wing extremist government into power. And it caused a lot of issues, obviously, because they were very anti-civil rights, very anti-labor rights, and the Jesuits were, through the lens of Catholic social teaching, calling for equity that the leftist movement had
So
called for.
that's
So,
actually the word that
yeah,
I could not remember. But the idea of liberation theology is a lot of what the
oh
Jesuits
yes,
preached. That this idea that according to the teachings of Jesus and the teachings in the Bible, this extreme inequity was not it could not exist according to God and according to Jesus's teachings. That so the Jesuits led this movement where they were gathering people in the communities they exist in, teaching them the word of God that they already, most of them, subscribed to, but teaching them that yes, they could rebel against the government. They could decide that this was not something they wanted for themselves or for their children, and could justify it with biblical teaching, which was revolutionary, because often Jesus and unfortunately, Christian faith has been a tool of imperialism for centuries. And this
mm-hmm.
was one of the first times that it was able to be flipped without kind of losing the message, that it was still, all right, Jesus was a man for the poor. He was a person for
Mm-hmm.
and with others. One of the biggest examples that was used was the idea of the Samaritan woman, that he helped her get her water and spoke to her as a human being, even though by all accounts in their society she was not. Um, and that idea that um, if we are not living as Jesus taught us, we are not true Christians or Catholics, and that their government was not leading their people or sustaining their people in the way Jesus taught us. And that idea, in some ways, while it was not directly connected with this liberation movement or the FMLN,
Hmm.
which was the party that was kind of the biggest force against the government, it did coincide that their ideas were very compatible. Um, and
Yeah.
that specifically is why the Jesuits suffered in the way that they did, because while they were not saying that they agreed with the FMLN, their teaching and their action kind of coincided with the same sorts of ideas. Um, and this is something I get really steamed about, is the
Hmm.
way that often movements for equality get conflated. That the idea is not to topple. The idea is to bring everyone to the same level. And
Yes.
that everyone, every human being, has the right to exist. And if your right to exist is being trampled by the people who are supposed to be protecting you, how can you stand by? And also using Jesus and religious teachings as a way to say Jesus would not have stood by. So what can I do
Yes.
to live like him?
Yes. No, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think that a lot of times we approach life and equality and justice as this zero sum kind of idea, right? Like, meaning if somebody else has it, that means I can't have it.
Yeah.
And my like favorite saying, to kind of counter that is, a rising tide lifts all ships. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like, true equity and justice means that we're all going to have access to everything we need, and if that means sacrificing a little bit of my privilege, that's okay, right?
Yeah.
Because we should all be uncomfortable with this idea that, like, I'm getting something at the expense of someone else because of privilege. I think that is a really heavy thing that should make none of us
No,
comfortable.
I totally, and this was something, this goes back more towards contemporary El Salvador, but right when our group arrived, they were about 3 months out of this movement where the government, even though it was FMLN controlled, um, the FMLN is still the most popular party in El Salvador post-revolution. Um, they there was this movement among elites and among government officials to privatize water, meaning
Mm,
to take so water access in all its forms would be controlled by private organizations, and that you would have to purchase water for any necessary any function from private organizations, um, and that water would be subject to the market. And this was something absolutely, absolutely problematic, because then it would have
right.
made life, it would have made sustenance of the human condition almost impossible for a lot of communities. Um, and they defeated, as a collective like nation, defeated this proposition um, with it within the government. So water was remained a public works, which was a lot of that movement was powered by this idea of liberation theology, that who says that one individual or a small collection of individuals is in charge of all of the life or the ability to live um, for everyone else. It was this like not a, which is not a very radical idea, um, but is
But somehow it is,
exactly.
yeah. So, I'm so glad that you're just telling all these stories, because I think, they make me really hopeful, um, you know, in the face of a lot of adversity. I was gonna ask you about, so okay, so when we talk, people might be wondering, well, why are you bringing up the Salvadoran Civil War? That happened decades ago, why is this something that we're still having conversations about? And I think the important point to bring up is that in the ways in which the U.S. government funded the abuse of Salvadoran people and raised money and provided a lot of terrorist organizations with power in that country, a lot of those systems still exist,
Yeah,
and a lot of lives are still threatened. So I think we go down to listen and to do acts of solidarity like you did. A lot of it happens in that context. Can you share, do you have any stories about, kind of the ways in which the Civil War is still affecting the lives of individuals today?
absolutely. So this is a problem, the gang violence in El Salvador and in what is it's termed as the Southern Triangle.
Mm.
So Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador did not originate there. And this is so during the war and after the war, and still currently, there is a mass movement of laborers going to the United States and entering the nation through illegal channels to work. Not because there isn't work at home, but because the labor in the United States pays better. And about 50% of El Salvador's current GDP is money from other quote unquote more developed nations of people sending their wages home. So this kind of blossomed around the time of the war as people were fleeing violence. And communities, specifically in Texas and Southern California, developed in the same way that during the Industrial Revolution, there were kind of pockets of ethnic neighborhoods in coastal cities. So the same thing begins to happen in the 80s and 90s in the United States. And then, unfortunately, 9/11 happens. And the way that we conceived immigration and the movement of people into the United States radically changed. ICE was founded and different organizations aimed at eliminating the presence of people who did not use the quote unquote correct channels to enter the United States. By this point, there are a lot of really small children who were born in the 80s and 90s who their parents didn't have the same kind of skills, but they kind of existed in between societies where their parents were living in the United States as if it was still El Salvador, but they grew up in American systems. They spoke kind of a different dialect of Spanish, and rather than and they wanted more for themselves, but they did not have the resources to do so, which is why a lot of them turned to gang violence and gang activity because it was a way to gain street cred, it was a way to gain money, and it was a way to kind of rise out of the poverty that they were born into through the channels that they could because they did not have papers and did not have access to the same kind of help that natural born citizens have. And this is happening at the same time that ICE is becoming more active. So a lot of these young men and young women were deported back to El Salvador, a country they had never truly lived in, and the only thing that they knew how to do was to gangbang. So things like MS-13 and the 18th Street Gang kind of got replanted in El Salvador in the mid 2000s and have kind of exploded since then, that there's this rash of people that are being deported to a country that they have no physical ties to and emotional ties to, doing the only things that they know how to do.
Right.
And on our first day in El Salvador, we met with a group of students who were about our age, a little younger, mostly high school, who were living in a neighborhood that was gang controlled. And there's this one student, his name was Kevin, and he was really struggling because he was 16 and he could no longer go to school. His father and his uncle were both in prison as gang members, but the rival gang had started to control the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
And because he was their kind of progeny, he could not move freely through his neighborhood without fear of being shot or harmed, or his family being harmed. And his mom would say to him, like, Kevin, because of this, like, you're not, it's going to be a lot harder for you to make your way out of this. And he was really struggling because he didn't know what else to do. He didn't want to join a gang, but it was looking like that was his only option to exist. And it was so troubling to hear him talk about this, and that this Catholic youth community that these students um, had created for themselves was a lot of what was keeping them out of trouble, because a significant number of them could no longer attend school for fear of gang violence that they themselves had no part in. Um,
Right.
and that's something that problem has really deep roots. It's not as simple as all people from these nations, and unfortunately our current executives rhetoric suggests that all of the people that are in the United States without the proper papers are gangbangers and drug dealers and rapists, and that is completely untrue.
Right.
Completely untrue. But the problems and the mechanisms that created some of these problems for those stereotypes are at the fault of American domestic policy.
Right.
And that's,
Right.
I find it immensely frustrating, because it's moving the blame away from what the truth is.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really important. Both to kind of talk about like how, you know, when our current federal government talks about MS-13, you know, we like to forget that we created MS-13,
Exactly.
and that it is homegrown in America. But then also, and maybe you remember this a little bit better than I do, but a another beloved member of the Lemoyne community who has is since moved on to do some other social justice work, Matthew Cortese,
Ah,
came back, and he came to a retreat that you and I both attended, and he was just giving us a talk, and I think he in a Central American country? Was he in Guatemala
he
or
was
El
in
Salvador?
Belize.
Belize. Okay. And he was telling a story about how he did a lot of ministry in prisons, and how he was working with a lot of young men who had been sentenced to jail because of gang activity. And the construction of what we like conceive a member of a gang to be is so far from the reality
Oh yeah.
of what these people actually are. These are people that are stuck in cycles of poverty and violence, that need to protect their families, that need to feed their families. And this is really the only way. Um, and something that I really appreciate about what Matthew Cortese was telling us, but then kind of just this greater conversation, is that we have to like look at all people as human beings, and it is when we can see the human in them that we can eradicate those systems of poverty and violence
Amen.
that create the inevitable situation that they get stuck in.
Amen. And I know you know of this particular priest, but Father Greg Boyle,
Yes.
the MVP, home founder of Homeboy Industries, that his ministry, specifically in Southern California, is to rehabilitate people that have gotten stuck in these cycles of
Yes.
forgiving them, helping them kind of erase those ties. One of the things that their ministry does is they match young men with jobs, and young women with jobs, and teach them skills. Once that they can kind of get started and get settled, they help them remove their gang tattoos, which is something that often kind of you don't think of, but that physical representation that can kind of inhibit someone from being accepted, that they can help them accept themselves again. And the other piece of that too is to do the emotional work, that this is a psychologically really stressful experience, and to
Yeah.
talk to these men and women as human beings, and to sit down with them and really help them work through the demons that have kind of been contributing to a lot of what happens in these cycles. And it's really, I would highly recommend to the listeners to read any and all of his literature. We read one of his books that I am losing the name of at the current moment, but it was talking about his experience and his experience ministering to individuals that might not get the time of day from other communities.
Yeah.
And that, so it's Tattoos on the Heart, The Power of Boundless Compassion is the book that we read prior to going to El Salvador. He is a lovely human being and sees others, I think, as Jesus wants us to see. So in this quarantine, that's on your reading list.
That's right. We all need a reading list right
Oh,
now during
yes.
quarantine.
Yes.
I need to stop scrolling through Instagram. No,
Oh my
as much
gosh.
as I am. No, I'm really glad you brought up Father Boyle. I actually quoted him in the like season intro that we posted.
Ah.
It was not there was a professor at John Carroll University who wrote this really lovely letter about what solidarity looks like in the time of social distancing. And he basically just said, and I'm gonna butcher the quote, but it goes something like this. It's we have to see God as this circle of compassion, and the circle extends so far that it reaches the margins. So slowly, those margins themselves are erased.
Ah, I love
Which
that.
I love
I
that
love
quote.
that.
And I think that that is just such a good kind of idea about like what social justice and what solidarity means. And so, okay, for playing devil's advocate here, for anyone who is listening who might be thinking, all right, well, this sounds like really terrible things, but bad things are happening in America right now, and while I do care about what's happening throughout the world, I just don't see how this relates
Oh boy.
to the country and the world that I'm living in right now. Well, immigration is such a hot topic in America. Let's talk a little bit about the push factors that make someone feel like they have to leave their home country of El Salvador to maybe come to the United States of America, without documents. Because I think you'd probably agree with this. I don't think there's no such like no human being is illegal.
Oh yeah.
Um,
I've got a pin on, I call it my social justice jacket. All of my social justice pins. I've got
yeah.
one that says that.
I mean, like literally, borders are a social construction. Nationhood is a social construction. Like,
Amen.
we won't even get into
Yeah,
that.
that's a much longer. That's episode 2.
That's right. Oh, I'm so glad you'll come back.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, so like we won't get into that. But can we talk a little bit about kind of some of the things that you saw in El Salvador, some of the stories that you
Oh
heard,
yeah.
and how that connects back to immigration in the United States, specifically because before you start, because I know you have so many good stories about this, I want to tell our listeners that 2 springs ago, the Trump administration ended what was called TPS, Temporary Protective Status, for Salvadorans who had come to the United States during the Reagan administration fleeing violence.
Mm-hmm.
And now they face the threats of deportation. Now, I'm going to be honest with everybody. It's hard to kind of keep track of everything that is happening in the world all the time. And I know that some of these policies have been reversed, but at one point this was canceled and the safety and establishment of these families in America were threatened. So yeah, all right. So with that context, take
Yeah.
it away, Julia.
So this is another organization that our listeners should look into. It's called Confamide. Um, they do work with individuals or families who have members of their family have gone missing in the process of going to another nation to work. Um, a lot of Salvadorans, there is labor to be done in El Salvador. People are not fleeing because there isn't work. They're fleeing because the work does not pay enough to keep their families alive. Um, that a lot of people are leaving to kind of get roots in another place. They're fleeing violence. Again, violence we already discussed was not originated in that nation.
Mm-hmm.
And they're looking for stability because it's if one member of a family can go to the United States, can work, and then can work for a wage that is enough for them to kind of survive in the United States and then have extra to send home, it increases a family's stability so that ultimately that laborer can return. That's another piece that often gets kind of brushed under the rug with the rhetoric that like they're here to steal our jobs. No, they don't want to stay. The
Yes.
goal is
Right.
to give themselves and their families enough economic stability that they can all be together again. Um,
Yeah.
and that's something that the push factors outweigh the incredible risk that a lot of these individuals incur by leaving.
Mm-hmm.
And that is kind of where Confamide comes in. Um, I'm not totally sure of the 2019 statistics, but the 2017 statistics suggested that about a third of people who attempt to go to the United States or to another nation to do labor go missing.
Right.
And
Yeah.
there's the risk of moving by yourself without proper channels. Like it's an incredibly dangerous experience. I don't want to get into the gory details. That's something if you look up Confamide has an excellent website um, that they try to do the investigative work for families who have members that have gone missing. And it was founded by um, a man whose wife went missing um, on her way to the United States. And it tries to give closure to these families who all they're looking for is stability and that they have, that they're willing to take the risk um, to attempt to find stability. Um, it's a really sad thing. I'm getting like kind of choked up thinking about it.
Yeah.
But that's something that, again, goes back to Catholic teaching and this idea that all human beings have the right to exist. And if
Right.
you
Right.
cannot physically exist in your nation and in the space that you're born in and the country that you love, and you're willing to leave and you're willing to incur bodily harm and possibly death to achieve some kind of stability in that place, I think it's our duty to step up and listen and to
Yeah.
really listen and hear what's going on.
That is so beautifully said. And I think, and I don't want to conflate issues here.
Oh yeah.
But I want to say, when I was hearing you talk about this, a way in which this might seem more real for a lot of people, because for many of us who, were born here, our parents were born here, have never really worried about, knowing where to call home. I think this can just seem so impossible to
Oh
comprehend.
yeah.
And I think maybe a good way to kind of contextualize this in the present moment is, so a lot of immigration activists have this phrase. They say nobody wants to leave their country of origin, for these reasons, right? Like
Yeah.
it is, people are literally pushed out. Um, and if we think about, all of our kind of individual home, and again, I don't want to conflate issues here, sound like I'm, reducing violence and the plight of immigrants to, anything kind of simple or trivial. But if you think about, the fact that a lot of us were pushed out of our homes at Lemoyne because of coronavirus without really any way to kind of fix. And obviously the administration and the school has done such a great job of protecting us all and, taking care of us and, trying to make a lot of the losses that we're all experiencing as a community right. But, nobody wanted to leave, right? But
Yeah.
we all understand that we had to leave for the safety and well-being of others, right?
Yeah.
But then, like, obviously, again, just like massive disclaimer with that, like, that is nothing, like, obviously, my livelihood was not threatened, going from Syracuse to home. Like, I was, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? But
That's an interesting, it's a another way, that analogy is another way of privilege contextualization. That it's a
mm-hmm,
similar, like, we had no choice in the matter. It was the way that we can keep ourselves and one another safe. But also that I know I had the ability to return, get all of my things, and come back. Um, I know a lot of other students don't have that ability yet, but that idea that it's, you have to leave your community, but we
right,
have all of these kind of protections, and we have a plan, and there's a place for you to go. You're not, and that's again another contextualizing of privilege. The student fund that the school that Lemoyne has set up, there's a pretty significant number of students who don't have home stability, and having to kind of up and leave our campus has been really difficult for them. So if you
yeah,
have anything to spare, that would be a really good place to kind of put it, is
yes,
to um, help in stabilizing fellow dolphins. We don't swim alone.
right. And especially since that there is probably a reimbursement at some level that will be coming back to a lot of us.
Yes.
I would definitely encourage people, even if it's not your own money, if it's, if it's your parents' money, if it's your family's money, to definitely ask them to donate a portion of that. No portion is too small to the Emergency Student Fund.
Yes.
Um, so the reason I made um, that comparison was just in the most fundamental sense, is that feeling of, you know, despair and anger and confusion that I think many, if not all of us, felt when we realized we wouldn't be able to return to campus. Multiply that
Yeah.
exponentially, and that is would I think that's probably what people who are forced out of their home countries, especially in Central America, feel
Oh
like.
yeah. That it's and that is what in the community that we visited in El Papaturo, that they left only long enough to ensure their safety, and all they wanted to do was go back, that like to be in the place that they love, and to do the things that they love to do with the people they love. um that was something I think um is isn't always discussed in terms of conversations about immigration. um Holy mackerel, the resiliency. And that's something
Mm-hmm.
that I think we like to talk about in other contexts in the US, and that's something that kind of gets lost in these conversations, and is a way to rehumanize people that are often dehumanized in the ways that they're portrayed in the media and in politics. They
Right.
just want to survive. They're people. That's all they want to laugh with their families,
Yeah.
and enjoy the sun. And that was something, one of the things that El Papaturo did as soon as they had the funding and the stability, was they built a soccer field. And every
Mm-hmm.
Sunday there's like other similar communities that they travel on Sundays and play soccer, that they go to church in the morning and they play soccer afterwards. And it was
Yeah.
so and two of the this was the one of the coolest things. Two of the women that we traveled with are on the Lemoyne soccer team. Um and
Oh.
told others that they kind of communicated with the community and were like, we play soccer at home. And they were like, really, you do? And they found extra uniforms for them. And the girls got suited up and played on this team.
Oh my God, that's
It was
incredible.
the coolest thing, that it was that um, Tiffany and I and Vilma found this language with which to kind of become solid, like to have solidarity with each other, that we figured out this way of communicating. And these other two students at Lemoyne had their own method of communicating, that this was the way that they bonded with everyone, was their athleticism and their connection to this game that does not have language. Um,
Yeah.
it was one of the, and they made friends with these other kids in the community that, um even though they didn't have to, all of the work that some of the things that we did during the day, they would just do with us because they knew that as soon as we were done, we would play soccer with them. And it was the most fun. I have to say, like, that kind of joy um is so universal, and it was the coolest, one of the coolest things I've ever experienced, were those soccer games.
That's incredible. That is, I love that story. I think I've heard it before, but I don't know if you can hear it, but I'm just
No, I
like
can hear it in your voice, the smile. Yeah.
megawatt smile right now. So okay, so kind of to, I mean, I could talk to you about El Salvador and immigration justice for hours.
Yes.
Um,
But
but,
not everybody wants
but
to listen to that.
not everyone wants to listen to it for if you do, message us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and Julie and I'll
we
just do this
can
for
we
five
can have
hours
a
straight.
Zoom. We can have a
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Teaching about immigration justice via
Yes.
Zoom.
Actually, let's make
Um,
this a thing.
yeah, honestly, why
Yes.
not? But can you talk a little bit about, so you've told us some really incredible stories about your time in El Salvador. What does that look like in terms of solidarity and action back home here in Syracuse in the US?
Um, so for me, one of those things, and this is mainly in terms of the academia that I participate in. Um, so I'm graduating at the end of the hopefully graduating at the end of this semester. And one of the things that I have kind of translated my experience in is, one, talking to people constantly about this, because the more people know and the more that it's in their kind of front facing consciousness, the more that it can translate into action in their lives. And the
Mm-hmm.
second piece of it is trying to tailor the academic work that I do, and the work that I want to continue doing after I graduate, in keeping these populations in mind. Um,
Yeah.
so I wrote a thesis last year, on diary writing, and specifically the ways that, um, when someone's external surroundings are so incredibly tenuous, that they find internal space with which to grow. Um, my case study specifically looked at a woman in World War II, but I've been trying to do this other research in looking at diaries and looking at art, and other ways that people kind of express their humanity in turmoil, and talking about those things. Um, that is something that I kind of get a lot of joy in just doing that research for myself. That even if it's something that is not public, talking about it, in terms of conversation in your everyday life, but also in the way that you carry yourself in space, um, being mindful of the ways that, um, I have privilege, and being and kind of, so this is, I'm having trouble explaining this because it's kind of a new thing, that I've been doing, where every day I try to journal, and I try to
Yeah.
contextualize the things that I am thankful for, and the things that, even if they're not discussed, what I can do in my daily life to not to help in some way. One of those things for me, has been, I've been trying to limit, the amount of fast fashion I consume.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of those companies like Fashion Nova and Forever 21, and, um, kind of very inexpensive fast fashion. A lot of their textiles come from, El Salvador and the Central, Triangle, and from South Asia, and they do not pay their workers equitably. So, trying to look at
Right.
what I'm consuming and how it's being produced. Um, I love to thrift anyway, so that has been something that I've been trying to
Yes.
shift. When I am not wearing something, I donate it. When I'm looking for something new, I go to Goodwill, I go to the Salvation Army, because um, I would rather not consume something that is being produced in an unethical way. I'm also trying to avoid companies that I know are doing these things specifically. Um, I know Fiona and I were in a class about masculinity last semester. And one
Yes,
of the brands that we talked about, I'm going to shout them out because they should not be
please
in
do.
your lexicon of clothing, is Lululemon. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Lululemon is on record as to use slave labor to produce their clothing. They severely mark up the prices and are one of the biggest culprits um, of readjustment of sizing, which is just problematic in so many ways. This is episode 3 where we'll
Yes,
discuss. Um,
exactly. You're planning out my entire season
uh,
for me right here. I
I'm
love
glad.
it.
I'm glad. I'm here for it. But that's one of those things, is looking at um, more ethical consumption. And that's again a product of the fact that I have economic privilege where I can kind of pick and choose how I consume things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think that's a way of kind of working it into your normal life without having to put yourself on a pedestal and just say, you know what? How can I do better for the earth? How can I do better for people in a way that is just me existing? Um, and that
Right.
it's not a lot of work. It's not a huge change. It's just kind of shifting, like, what do I need? Do I really need it?
Yeah.
And if I do need it, how can I get it in a good way?
Yeah. No, I think that's really important. I have had a lot of conversations. So, like, kind of for me, the reason we're having this greater conversation is to look at stories of activism and solidarity and hope that are maybe not related to coronavirus, but can transition to so many of the different um, issues that we're seeing coronavirus bring up. Um, in terms of just like actions of
Yeah.
solidarity and support and activism in our everyday lives that make people feel like they can engage in this kind of help, even if they don't have a medical degree or they're not an essential worker in any way.
Yeah.
Um, so for me, I think you bring up a really great point. If you're able to be a conscious consumer, be a conscious consumer, with what you purchase. But then I also think you brought up a really good point when you were talking about journaling and everything. And it's just like, you know, don't write this off.
Yeah.
Like, what if when we change the way we think about things, um, in our own minds. When we change the narrative of immigration, of gang violence, when we change those fundamental things that are, when we are told to think about it one way, but we think about it in the perspective of social justice and solidarity, like that in and of itself is a revolutionary act of activism.
Absolutely. I totally agree that it's something that if one of the things, this is a form of self-care for me. I've been watching RuPaul's Drag Race while I do
Love that for
homework,
you.
and Ru always concludes every like competition with, and if you can't love yourself, how can you love someone else? And I think in some ways
Mm-hmm.
that's how activism starts, is that if you can try to understand your individual place in the world, your place as a person with and without levels of privilege, your place as a person of the actions and the way that you think, and using those to your advantage to do some good for other people, then that's the best way to get other people involved, is being an example of self-reflection and then action as a result of that reflection. That
Yeah,
thoughtful activism. I
that's
That's
right.
my RuPaul. We're getting it. We're bringing
There
it
we
back.
go. Well, and I think like the other thing is that as people who are Jesuit educated, which the majority of our listeners are, but anyone who's listening, I'm sure they will be able to make the parallels between kind of changing the thought process of how we think about immigrate. Like, definitely do that. But also, when you're consuming coronavirus news, like, change the way you think about essential workers, change the way you think about farm workers. something, change the way you think about how healthcare should be in the
Oh
United
yeah.
States, because all of these are justice issues that are also intersectional and would keep this going for hours and hours. Before I let you go, Julia, I just want to. So I did this thing on the intro episode where I shared 2 stories of hope, um, specifically in regards to coronavirus, which, because I'm calling this the lights inside the tunnel, in which, light is casting out the darkness in the present moment. So I want to share 2 of the stories with you
Excellent.
now.
I'm ready.
We can all feel good and think about it and, leave feeling a little bit better than when we started this conversation an hour ago. So the first story is that Cottonelle, that tissue brand, is donating $1 million to coronavirus relief efforts. And I'm combining this because they're both acts of donation. Arnold Schwarzenegger has donated $1 million worth of masks and medical supplies to hospitals most in need right now.
That
Isn't that
is awesome. Let's go, Governor.
Yes. Yes. And let's go for conscious businesses.
Oh yeah.
Giving back when they're making billions of dollars.
Yeah.
Support those businesses. If we're talking about being a conscious consumer, support
Amen.
those businesses. Support businesses that are supporting their
Amen.
workers, because labor rights are very
Indeed.
important.
Indeed.
And the second story I want to tell you is it's happening pretty close to us. Close to me because it's closer to where I live, but also fairly close to all of our home base in Syracuse. A Toronto landlord has canceled rents for all of his tenants for the foreseeable future.
Man.
This was going viral on Twitter and Instagram the other day. I don't know if you saw it, but basically, one of his tenants screenshotted the messages. He sent them all individually and posted it, and just was like, "Oh, look at my really awesome landlord." And people just picked it up. He basically said to them, he was like, "Listen, like, I really don't care about money. I care about you guys. You don't have to pay rent for the foreseeable future. And when your next rent payment is due, I'll give you a 30-day heads up." And like, I could be wrong here because I don't know the whole story, but what it sounded like is he's just like fully canceling the rent.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Like,
oh my gosh.
You don't have to make it up. Isn't that incredible?
And amen to people that have the economic flexibility to do so. This is what you should be doing.
Yeah.
Giving people, oh my gosh, I love that. I really, thank you. Thank you for sharing, dear.
Well, and Toronto is such an expensive place to live. So just to think about, like, and I'm sure, I mean, this went viral, but I am sure there are some really great people in cities like New York and Los Angeles and Chicago, and, cities all over the world, London,
I
Beijing,
did see something
hopefully there are people all over doing this.
I saw recently a guy that owns, I think it's like 10,000 properties or something crazy like that, is canceling 2 months of rent in Brooklyn. I know, and I know, responsible capitalists.
That just makes me really happy. Yeah. And it also inspires me, right? Like, I want to go out and, because right now, obviously, I prefer to kind of roll my sleeves up and involve myself in work that feels a little bit more tangible than just like giving money to places. But right now, because donations feel more like charity than justice.
But in this case,
we can't really leave the house to do acts of justice. So I think we can all give ourselves a little bit of grace and involve ourselves in charity, which enables justice.
I like that.
So I want to, go out and support a local restaurant and a local immigration group. Right now, we have so many in my hometown, and there's a bunch in Syracuse too if people are looking for just places to give. And you know what, honestly, like, if you're bored, like, email places and be like, hey, like, is there something I can do remotely for you? Volunteer work.
Thank you for bringing that up, and thank you for bringing up the restaurant aspect too. Restaurants are a really volatile business, And if you've got a place that's open for takeout still or delivery, support it. There's a local
Yes.
place in they're in Ballston Spa, which is near where I live, and they do a lot of really good Mediterranean places.
Ooh.
I'm looking up the name because it's escaping me. Um,
Yeah, I think my family is gonna eat out
yes.
tonight.
So if you live,
Yes. Eat out while eating
yes,
in. We're gonna pick something up somewhere and bring
they're
it
called
home
Ala
and
Turco.
and
If you're in the
ooh,
greater Ballston Spa region, they have the best falafel. It's gluten free.
I love
It's oh my
falafel.
gosh, I'm shouting them out because they're really nice. They also have great Turkish coffee. Okay, I gotta stop. I'm making myself hungry.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go get some lunch after this. Yeah, no, so I mean, and again, like context, Julie and I aren't like lecturing anyone and telling them
No.
what to do, but this is a reminder for
Yes.
us for what to do. And I know a lot of people just feel really hopeless right now, so hopefully these little actions will make you, and stories and conversations will make you feel a little bit more optimistic about life
Yes.
right now, while consciously engaging in the
Yes. And
reality.
I say this a lot. I'm in Joyful Noise, which is the choir, the music ministry choir group at Lemoyne. And Tom Andino and I say this to each other frequently, is feel your feelings. You're allowed to be
Mm-hmm.
really upset, and just kind of brushing it off
Yes.
and letting it go isn't always the best thing. Sometimes you can't be
Yes.
productive during the day, and that's okay. Feel
Yes.
your feelings, put them
Yes.
someplace, and try to understand them. That's kind of, I think, one of the best ways to actively perform activism is to understand why you're feeling a certain way, where those feelings are coming
Yes.
from, and letting yourself feel them. Be emo. It's okay.
Yeah. Well, and I think that the really important thing here that is like we did a lot of contextualizing privilege, which I think is so
Yes.
important, but I think that we can't um something that I struggle with a lot is I'm like, well, I'm so privileged, I'm not allowed to feel this way. And I think that's how a lot of people are
Yeah.
thinking right now. And that is
Yes.
counterproductive in the sense that then you trap these feelings in and you don't release them into the universe. And then you can't do things which, counteracts these systems of privilege because you are so, kind of surveilling your own self and your own performance as a person
Yeah.
in society that you can't be engaging in justice. So feel your feelings. I'm so glad you
Oh,
mentioned Tom Andino because um, Tom, Alice, Sister Anne, Father Dolan, all of the people who are working in campus ministry right now are really, really they
oh
miss
yeah. And reach
everyone.
out to them.
They're Yes, they have created kind of such a beautiful platform for us all to kind of create community through faith and through spirituality while we're being away. So please check in with campus ministry at Lemoyne on Lemoyne's campus ministry Facebook page, and then Lemoyne Camp Men on Twitter and
Yes.
Instagram. A lot of good stuff is happening. You'll see Julie and I there. Shout out to Julia. She's making playlists
Yes,
every
with Grace
Monday,
Adams.
which are bops. I know, two queens doing
Oh,
queenly
thank you.
things. So yeah, Julia, thank you so much for joining me for this
Thank
first
you for
episode. This
having
was
me. I
great.
really enjoyed it. I hope I'll be back.
Yes, I hope you'll come back. I am feeling just like a million times better, and I hope that everybody who's listening feels a little bit better. Just hearing some fresh voices, and hopefully you felt like you were part of this
Yes.
conversation too.
Yes.
Thank you all so much for tuning in to our first full episode, and I hope you'll tune in next week as well. Remember, new episodes will be posted every Tuesday and can be found on the Lemoyne Campus Ministry YouTube channel under the Playlists tab.
By the time this episode is posted, it'll be Holy Week, so I hope that all of you who observe Easter have a blessed holiday. Thank you again to Julia Walsh for joining us. I just love having conversations with her, and I hope you all enjoyed listening to the incredible wisdom and compassion she brings to everything. Please don't forget to connect with us online on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And until then, stay safe, wash your hands, and tell people you love them. Can't wait to talk with you all soon. Bye-bye.